Under the grey morning sky of September 1945, Tokyo was silent in a way it had never been before. The fires were gone, the air raids had ceased, yet the silence carried a new kind of fear, the fear of hunger. Across the city, blackened buildings stood like hollowed skeletons, their windows shattered, their foundations scarred by bombs. Smoke still rose faintly from piles of debris where once stood schools, homes, and markets. Women in worn kimonos moved through the ruins, carrying small wooden bowls, hoping to find scraps of rice. Children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes sat along the roadside, too weak to cry. Japan, once proud and defiant, now stood defeated, not just militarily, but in spirit, in stomach, and in soul. The war had stripped the nation bare. Rice paddies had been burned, fishing fleets sunk, and food convoys destroyed by relentless submarine warfare. The rationing system had collapsed months before surrender. Farmers kept their harvests hidden, fearful of government requisition. City dwellers traded family heirlooms for a few handfuls of barley or sweet potatoes. Even after Emperor Hirohito's voice trembled through the radio announcing surrender, the people didn't cheer. They listened in stunned silence, realizing peace had arrived, but food had not. In the first weeks after Japan's surrender, the U.S. occupation forces arrived to scenes that shocked even hardened soldiers. General Douglas MacArthur's men, expecting hostility, found instead frail civilians bowing weakly, too hungry to hate. American officers, once trained to destroy Japan's war machine, now faced a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable scale. Reports estimated that millions were on the brink of starvation by winter. The irony was heavy. The same nation that had bombed Tokyo into ashes would now have to save it from famine. Trucks bearing the white star of the U.S. Army rumbled through the narrow streets, carrying sacks of wheat flour and canned goods. For the first time, the Japanese saw the enemy not as conquerors, but as lifelines. Women lined up outside distribution centers, set up in schools and temples, clutching ration tickets printed in English and Japanese. American soldiers handed out loaves of bread, something most Japanese had never seen before. Children touched the crusts curiously, giggling as they bit into the soft foreign texture. It was not rice, but it was food. And it meant survival. Behind the scenes, the operation was a monumental logistical challenge. American supply officers worked with Japanese bureaucrats who still wore the same uniforms from the war. Convoys from Yokohama's port delivered wheat and corn imported from the United States and Australia. In warehouses that once stored munitions, soldiers repurposed machinery to grind grain into flour. Engineers converted abandoned naval depots into storage facilities, maintaining temperature and moisture control to preserve food supplies. What had once been the machinery of war became the infrastructure of mercy. MacArthur's staff understood the stakes. Starvation could turn victory into chaos. His policy was clear: feed the people first, rebuild later. American agronomists and dietitians were brought in, civilian experts who knew more about soil pH and protein content than artillery and tactics. They toured rural villages, advising farmers on modern irrigation, composting, and seed preservation. In northern Japan, teams repaired irrigation pumps destroyed by air raids, while engineers restored rail lines to move food faster to the cities. Every bag of wheat, every repaired bridge, every reopened kitchen became part of a quiet war against hunger. Still, resentment simmered in the shadows. Some Japanese veterans saw the food lines as humiliation, a reminder of their defeat. Others whispered about rumors that the Americans were feeding them only to control them. Yet those whispers faded when the smell of bread filled the air. By late 1946, families who had once boiled bark or grass could once again cook proper meals. Housewives began experimenting with pan, the Japanese word for bread, borrowed from Portuguese but now reinvented under American influence. Children in school lunch programs tasted milk for the first time. Nutritionists recorded measurable recovery in child health within months. The transformation was not only physical, but psychological. In the space of a year, the Japanese people's image of America began to shift. Soldiers who once appeared as towering occupiers now looked like protectors. The act of feeding, simple, repetitive, daily, carried an emotional weight that propaganda could never achieve. Many Japanese families began sending small letters of thanks to the occupation offices, some written in broken English, others illustrated with sketches of smiling children. "We eat bread today," one note read. "Thank you for peace of stomach." Even American troops felt the change. In their letters home, soldiers described scenes of gratitude instead of defiance. They told of little girls offering origami cranes in return for chocolate bars. They wrote about elderly men bowing deeply as convoys passed, about women crying quietly when sacks of flour arrived. The young men who had trained for invasion found themselves rebuilding bakeries instead of burning them. Some began to understand that their mission, though born of war, had evolved into something profoundly human. By the winter of 1947, Japan's food supply was stable for the first time since 1941. Agricultural output rose as fertilizer imports resumed, and rural reforms encouraged equitable land distribution. American policy planners realized that economic stability began not with currency or industry, but with the dinner table. Feeding Japan was not just charity, it was strategy. A hungry population could revolt, a nourished one could rebuild, and rebuild they did. Farmers returned to their fields, students returned to schools, and factories reopened to produce not weapons but household goods. Bread and rice, once symbols of East and West, began to coexist on the same table. The new Japan, humble, cautious, yet resilient, was taking shape, not through battles, but through meals shared in peace. Yet beneath the calm surface of this recovery lay questions the world had not yet asked. Could a nation so recently devastated truly trust the hand that had fed it? What hidden motives guided this generosity, morality, strategy, or control? And as Japan's people filled their bowls again, another hunger began to stir, not of the body but of the spirit. A hunger for dignity, identity, and independence in a world now shaped by its former enemy. That question, of whether nourishment could also become influence, would soon define the next stage of Japan's transformation. The answer would lie not in kitchens or fields, but in the uneasy corridors of power, where occupation turned into alliance and survival into submission. The story of feeding Japan was only the beginning. The true cost of that mercy was yet to unfold. By early 1948, the smoke from war had long cleared, but the machinery of peace was only beginning to hum. Japan was now a laboratory, an occupied nation undergoing a controlled transformation. The secret of that transformation, however, lay not in speeches or surrender documents, but in something far more tangible, the science of food itself. The Americans had not simply fed Japan, they had engineered its survival. Behind every loaf of bread and every bowl of reconstituted soup was a network of scientists, engineers, and logisticians whose expertise turned famine into function. In Yokohama's port warehouses, refrigeration units once used for naval rations were reassembled by American technicians to preserve perishable supplies arriving from the Pacific. Civil engineers mapped out food corridors, routes ensuring that grain shipments moved uninterrupted from ships to distribution centers across Honshu and Hokkaido. When winter storms struck northern Japan, U.S. Army Corps units deployed diesel convoys through treacherous mountain passes, their headlights cutting through blizzards as they delivered life-saving flour and dried milk. The system was intricate and modern. The Americans applied lessons learned from their own wartime logistics, the same efficiency that had kept entire armies fed across oceans. Food security became an operation of precision. The Quartermaster Corps calculated caloric requirements for different regions based on climate and population density. Nutrition specialists introduced powdered milk and fortified wheat blends that compensated for vitamin deficiencies common in post-war Japan. These innovations were new to the Japanese palate, but essential for rebuilding national health. Soldiers who had once manned artillery now manned supply chains, becoming unlikely architects of recovery. The turning point came with the Emergency Import Program, a massive effort that brought in millions of tons of food grains from the United States. What seemed like simple relief was, in truth, a coordinated campaign of industrial-scale logistics. American cargo vessels loaded in San Francisco and Seattle crossed the Pacific in escorted convoys, carrying the same care once reserved for ammunition. Dock workers in Yokohama, Osaka, and Kobe labored around the clock, unloading crates marked U.S. Government Relief. Japanese civilians watched in awe as cranes lifted enormous sacks emblazoned with the stars and stripes, symbols of abundance replacing the insignia of war. Yet the true genius of the operation lay deeper in technology and training. American agronomists, working with the remnants of Japan's Ministry of Agriculture, launched educational programs to teach modern farming practices. Demonstration plots showed how nitrogen-rich fertilizers could double yields in rice paddies that had been depleted by wartime neglect. New irrigation models were introduced, relying on mechanical pumps and reinforced concrete channels. Farmers who once plowed with oxen now experimented with small American tractors and rotary tillers, shipped as part of reconstruction aid. Every harvest became a classroom, every field a laboratory of reform. As the months passed, the transformation was visible from the air. Where once stood barren paddies, green shoots now shimmered in neat grids. Rivers ran through newly dredged channels, reflecting the metallic glint of American-built irrigation gates. In the cities, the smell of freshly baked bread drifted from school cafeterias and canteens. Urban bakeries, supplied with surplus wheat, became micro-industries, their owners trained by American technicians in temperature control and yeast cultivation. The idea was not only to feed the people, but to seed an economy. Every bakery, every noodle shop, every restored farm was a node in a vast network of self-sufficiency. Still, the Americans understood that technology alone would not be enough. The Japanese had to believe in their own recovery. So occupation officials launched a campaign of food education. Posters appeared in schools and community halls, illustrating the importance of balanced nutrition. Children were taught songs about bread and milk, symbols of modernity and progress. Housewives attended cooking demonstrations where American dietitians explained how to make nutritious meals from imported ingredients. Slowly, the stigma around foreign food began to fade. Bread, once alien, became a staple. Milk, once considered indulgent, became a necessity. In the countryside, resistance softened. At first, older farmers distrusted the Americans' fertilizers, claiming the chemicals would poison their soil. But when yields doubled, doubts evaporated. The same farmers who once hid grain from government collectors now formed cooperatives encouraged by U.S. advisors. These cooperatives pooled resources to buy better tools, manage storage, and negotiate fair prices. For the first time, Japan's rural poor had leverage in a system that had long oppressed them. What had begun as a relief effort was evolving into a social revolution. The success was not without hardship. There were missteps, shipments lost to storms, warehouses flooded, rumors of contamination spreading panic. In one instance, a delayed convoy led to food riots in Yokosuka as desperate citizens tried to seize army trucks. But even these moments of chaos revealed the fragile dependence that had developed. The Japanese no longer feared the Americans as invaders. They feared losing them as providers. Meanwhile, American planners debated how long such assistance could continue. Feeding an entire nation was expensive, and public sentiment in the U.S. was divided. Some senators questioned why former enemies were receiving aid while parts of Europe still struggled. But for the military and policy architects, Japan was more than a humanitarian concern. It was a strategic outpost in an uncertain new world. The Cold War was emerging, and a stable, well-fed Japan was a barrier against communist influence in Asia. Food, therefore, became more than sustenance. It was policy, diplomacy, and ideology served in rations and loaves. MacArthur's headquarters issued new directives: food, security as foundation for democracy. American experts drafted agricultural reform acts that redistributed land from wealthy landlords to tenant farmers, giving them ownership and incentive. It was radical and risky. Yet within 2 years, production surged and rural income rose. Japan's dependence on American shipments began to wane, replaced by domestic resilience. Grain storage facilities, designed by American engineers but run by Japanese crews, symbolized this shift, a nation once fed by its conqueror now feeding itself again. But beneath the optimism, a quiet transformation was unfolding in the minds of the Japanese. The children raised on school milk and bread began to see America not as an enemy but as a model. The taste of foreign food carried an unconscious message: modernity, comfort, and progress. The occupation forces had introduced more than nutrition. They had introduced aspiration. The rebuilding of Japan's stomach had become the rebuilding of its identity. By 1949, hunger had receded, replaced by industry. Food factories that once packaged relief supplies now produce noodles, canned vegetables, and sweets for domestic consumption. Japan's culinary culture adapted, merging Western techniques with traditional flavors. What emerged was not imitation, but innovation. Soy sauce factories began experimenting with mass fermentation, noodle makers with hybrid flours. American occupation authorities, who once supervised every shipment, now became advisors in a flourishing food economy. Still, a question lingered among Japanese intellectuals and politicians alike. Could dependence on American aid evolve into partnership, or was it simply another form of control? The Japanese diet had changed, their farms had changed, their markets had changed, even their perception of nourishment was different. The occupation's success was undeniable, but so was its subtle influence. For every bag of wheat came not just calories, but a quiet reordering of values. In the aftermath of devastation, food had become power, and power, once tasted, was hard to relinquish. The American occupiers had done more than prevent starvation. They had reshaped Japan's future with every meal served, every child fed, every factory rebuilt. But as the decade drew to a close, a new challenge emerged. What happens when the teacher must step back and the student must stand alone? By the dawn of the 1950s, Japan stood transformed. The country that had once knelt in surrender was now rising from the ruins, not through force of arms, but through the steady rhythm of work, production, and renewal. The streets that had echoed with cries of hunger now buzzed with the sound of commerce. Trains carried rice instead of troops. Ships once designed for war now transported wheat, coal, and machinery. The American occupation's greatest weapon had not been the atom bomb or the rifle. It was the spoon. What began as a desperate humanitarian mission had evolved into one of history's most successful social engineering projects. The American occupation authorities had understood an ancient truth. Before a man can rebuild his home, he must first fill his stomach. Food security was not merely an act of mercy. It was the foundation of governance. When the Americans fed Japan, they fed its will to live, and when they nourished its children, they sowed loyalty and stability. Psychologists from the occupation forces observed something remarkable. Families that had once been broken by loss were reforming around the dinner table. Communal eating, a cornerstone of Japanese culture, returned with renewed strength. Shared meals created shared purpose, and shared purpose nurtured trust, not just within families but between the Japanese people and their new overseers. Surveys conducted by occupation social scientists revealed a dramatic drop in resentment toward the United States by 1948. Gratitude, it seemed, had replaced grievance, but the story was not without complexity. While food saved lives, it also reshaped identity. Western diets subtly altered habits, health, and even national consciousness. The Japanese physique began to change. The average height of children increased as protein intake rose. Bread replaced rice at school lunches. Milk became a morning ritual, and American-style canteens appeared in factories. A generation grew up associating nutrition with progress and America with modernity. This was soft power in its purest form, invisible yet irresistible. The psychological dimension of feeding Japan extended beyond simple sustenance. American planners saw food as a stabilizing agent in a region on the brink of ideological conflict. Across Asia, communist movements were rising, promising equality through revolution. In Japan, the Americans offered a different promise: prosperity through nourishment. Propaganda was unnecessary when full stomachs spoke louder than slogans. A fed nation would not riot. A fed child would not rebel. Bread, not bullets, secured Japan's allegiance. At the same time, the Japanese government, under Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, began to internalize these lessons. Food became national policy. Agricultural ministries pushed for self-sufficiency, investing in modern irrigation, fertilizers, and rural electrification. The government encouraged domestic industries to emulate American production models. Farmers formed cooperatives modeled on U.S. systems. Factories standardized packaging, and new companies emerged to meet rising consumer demand. Within a few short years, Japan's dependence on imported grain began to wane. Engineers and scientists who had once designed aircraft for war now turned their ingenuity toward agriculture and food processing. Mitsubishi engineers built milling machines, Hitachi developed refrigeration systems. Toshiba produced kitchen appliances. This technological shift was not incidental. It was the logical evolution of a nation retooled for peace. The miracle of Japan's recovery was not just industrial. It was agricultural, domestic, and deeply human. By 1952, when the Allied occupation officially ended, Japan was producing enough food to sustain itself. The final convoys of American wheat left Yokohama under calm skies. Soldiers who had once been greeted with fear now departed to the sound of children waving small American flags, not out of submission, but gratitude. For many Japanese families, the occupation had become part of their own story of survival. There were tears, yes, but also pride. They had endured the unendurable and learned to live again. Yet the legacy of that era went far beyond full stomachs. The social fabric of Japan had been rewoven. The reforms initiated under American oversight, land redistribution, cooperative farming, school lunch programs, became permanent fixtures of the post-war state. Nutrition had become national culture. The Japanese word for bread pan, once exotic, was now as ordinary as rice. And with that normalization came a subtle shift. The memory of hunger faded, replaced by a determination never to know it again. In universities and think tanks, a new generation of scholars began to analyze the transformation. They noted how food had become the first bridge between conqueror and conquered. No treaty, they argued, could have healed Japan as effectively as a loaf of bread handed to a starving child. The US Army had achieved what years of diplomacy could not. It had turned sustenance into solidarity. This was not the reconstruction of a nation alone. It was the re-engineering of emotion, but not all reflections were celebratory. Critics pointed out that the same policies that stabilized Japan also tethered it to American influence. Imported wheat, powdered milk, and surplus agricultural commodities created dependencies that shaped trade for decades. Japan's post-war diet mirrored its post-war politics, nourished by America, constrained by it too. Independence, some said, had been traded for convenience. Food security came at the cost of autonomy. Still, the practical outcomes could not be denied. By the late 1950s, Japan's life expectancy had risen sharply, infant mortality had dropped, and famine had become unthinkable. In classrooms, children learned nutrition alongside mathematics. School kitchens, an American innovation, became training grounds for cooperation and civic responsibility. The idea that a nation's strength lay not in its soldiers, but in its citizens' health became central to Japan's modern identity. Across the Pacific, American observers watched with pride. Newspapers in the United States published photographs of smiling Japanese children eating bread, hailing it as proof of democracy's success. The program's administrators, once anonymous officers in drab uniforms, were honored in Washington as pioneers of humanitarian strategy. They had demonstrated that compassion could be logistical, that victory could be measured not in battles won, but in lives restored. In Japan, the memory of the occupation softened with time. What had begun as subjugation transformed into alliance. The same soldiers who had enforced surrender now left behind a blueprint for prosperity. Food had become diplomacy, and diplomacy had become destiny. When Japan joined the global economy as a peaceful power, it carried within its culture the lessons of those hungry years, that survival begins with compassion, and peace begins with nourishment. In the quiet suburbs of Tokyo, grandmothers still told their grandchildren about the days when bread first came to Japan. They spoke of standing in long lines outside American trucks, of tasting sweetness after years of bitterness, of seeing hope take the form of a single meal. These stories, humble yet profound, formed an invisible archive of gratitude, the kind that does not fade from memory. Japan's journey from ashes to abundance remains one of history's most powerful transformations. It was not driven by conquest or ideology, but by understanding that to heal a nation one must first feed its people. The Americans learned it, the Japanese lived it, and the world watched as enemies became partners over the simplest act of humanity, the breaking of bread. And as the final pages of occupation closed, a quiet truth lingered in the hearts of those who had witnessed it all. Wars may end with surrender, but peace begins with a meal shared between former foes.